Okay, welcome everybody. We'd like to thank you very much for joining this informational webinar today on the new per pupil expenditure or PPE reporting requirements for schools. My name is Greg Waples. I'm the Senior Manager of State Engagement and Outreach for NASSP. And we're excited to be joined on the webinar today by some of our great partners and friends with the Collaborative for Student Success and HCM Strategies. Presenting on today's webinar are myself, Adam Ezring, who is the Deputy Director at the Collaborative for Student Success, Duncan Robb, a Director at HCM Strategies, and Jessica Lawrence, an Associate at HCM Strategies. NASSP recently partnered with the Collaborative for Student Success to inform our members and stakeholders about the new PPE reporting requirements and why it's so important that principals know what's changing. We've also worked with the Collaborative to develop some new resources that can assist school leaders with this issue, and we're really excited to share some of that work with you today. Adam, Duncan, and Jessica are going to explain what's changing with how districts and individual schools must report PPE data, which states are already experiencing these changes in reporting and where it will be coming soon, and what principals and school leaders need to know about these important changes. By the end of the webinar today, we hope to leave you prepared to answer questions that you may field from parents, community leaders, the media, and others. And we also hope to equip you with actionable knowledge that you can use to advocate for additional resources that are needed in your school and for your students. Just a quick housekeeping note, we can take questions throughout the webinar today. So everybody is currently on mute that's in the webinar except for the presenters. But you can use the chat box feature in Zoom meetings to submit questions. So if you look on the toolbar and under More, you'll see a field for chat. So if you click on that, if you have a question at any point during the webinar, just go ahead and enter it into that chat box. And then when we get to the end, we'll take all of the questions that have been entered throughout the webinar. So with that, I am now going to turn it over to our presenters, Adam, Duncan, and Jessica.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. And really happy to be here. And thank you so much to everybody who's taken time out of your days. We know how hard you all work to spend time with us. So great to be here. So my name is Duncan Robb. I am the Director of K-12 Policy at HCM. And joining me in with the mic here this afternoon is Jessica Lawrence, who's an associate at HCM. And HCM and the Collaborative for Student Success have been working together to sort of explore the implications and possibilities that come with the collection and release of per pupil spending data for a few years now. And we're excited to share with you all on the phone what we've learned and why we think these data are important, especially for principals. So we value so much our partnership with Greg and the folks at NASSP for giving us sort of the time with you all today. So we're going to start with some baseline knowledge about the requirements for per pupil reporting, and then we're going to give some examples to show you all kind of like what we think are best practice when it comes to how states are reporting these data. And I'll just say that within our research on how to communicate per pupil expenditure to the larger educational community, including teachers, families, and community members, we have consistently found that principals tend to be the most trusted source of information. So with that in mind, we hope that after this brief webinar and additional resources we've provided, that you feel more comfortable talking about this new information and are compelled to act if necessary. So on the slide here, you see the goals for the webinar. The ultimate goal of this presentation is to empower principals like yourselves to have or lead informed conversations about per pupil spending data with various outside audiences, from parents to school board members and everything in between. So to meet that objective, we hope to help you understand what the Every Student Succeeds Act requires and define some important terms. And then, like I said, we'll introduce some additional resources to support that role sort of towards the end of this time. So the next slide has our agenda. So we'll go over the nitty-gritty, what's required in the new provision under the Every Student Succeeds Act that addresses per pupil expenditure. Then we'll move through some examples. in state report cards, and finally go through what it means for you. So on the next slide, so we'll unpack sort of the per pupil expenditure provision, and I'll just apologize at the top. It's just a tongue twister. Every time I try to say it, per pupil expenditure, it just does not come off the tongue like you'd hope. If only the framers of the law had done a better job with naming the provision, but it's what we got. But this is essentially the collective cost of what it takes to educate a student on a day-to-day basis. So this includes things like instruction and food services, all the way down to transportation and building maintenance. So all of these day-to-day activities are included in the number reported as per pupil expenditure. So the next slide has a simple calculation that just outlines, how this would be calculated. So Greg, if you'd go to the next slide, please. What we're talking about, what used to be reported, the only thing that was required was spending at the district level. So the total district expenditures divided by the number of students was the district per pupil expenditure. But as everybody on the phone knows, the average spending per pupil across a district doesn't necessarily reveal differences in spending within schools. So the new provision now requires schools to do the same thing by totaling up expenditures, adding a share of what the district spends for the school, and dividing that number by whatever metric the district and the state use to determine student count. So, and as you all know, the methods that states use to determine student count can change. So, for example, some states might determine student count based on attendance, average daily attendance, while others use actual enrollment. So, states have to describe how they determine student count, but those do certainly change across states. So on the next slide, so essentially what the Every Student Succeeds Act requires states to do is, in addition to other reporting requirements inherent in the law, states have to report actual school level spending versus only budgeted or estimated expenditures or spending at the district level. So this offers a new level of transparency into how states and districts are prioritizing equity or assigning resources within the districts to the various schools they're in. So the actual figures that states are required to report include personnel and non-personnel costs for districts and schools. And moreover, states are also required to break down revenue streams for districts and schools by federal, state, and local sources, which again, just all in the interest of providing clarity into how funding is allocated, again, school by school, as opposed to sort of averaged across the district. So all that information is helpful and great, but we would be remiss if we didn't sort of touch on the fact that some questions still exist here. So the calculation on the slide a couple of slides ago made it all look so simple, but I think most, if not everybody here on the phone, knows that things can get complicated, and states are bound to calculate per pupil expenditure a bit differently. So recently, the U.S. Department of Education released some guidance, where they sort of highlighted the flexibility states and districts have regarding their methodology for calculating per pupil expenditure. So there are sort of three types of expenditures that states were wrestling with: those that were sort of clearly spent at the school level and recorded at the school level, those expenditures that are recorded at the central level that impact a particular school, and those, excuse me, recorded at the central level for central administrative functions. So there's still sort of this question for states who have not released their data yet as far as how they report personnel and non-personnel costs across schools and districts. So for example, a school psychologist who spends time across multiple schools, or district-wide professional development provided to teachers at specific schools. So states and districts sort of have to agree. Well, a state and their districts have to agree on how those expenses get reported, and that that just means that per pupil expenditure might not be comparable with two schools in two different states, but per pupil expenditure is comparable within schools, within a state, and within one district. So what's included within per pupil expenditure is shown here. So it's pretty much the kitchen sink. Most of the guidance provided by the Department of Education referenced the National Center of Education Statistics, or NCES, who have been pulling national level per pupil data for some time and had developed a methodology around that. So what that means is, everything you see here on the slide are included in sort of the calculation of that cost. So the law requires, again, all personnel and non-personnel expenses, salaries and benefits, administration supplies, service purchase within schools and districts, and also includes debt, payments, and capital outlays. So all that can get brought in. So on the next slide, there's just a visual of what historically the districts have been spending their money on. So this is a figure that's derived from the Census Bureau in 2010. So the numbers are a bit dated, and the amounts are, I should point out, are in billions of dollars. But this reflects how money is generally spent in education at the local or district level. So it gives us a visual representation of how localities and districts allocate funding and what they allocate it towards. So obviously, instruction takes up the bulk of spending, which includes, all of that instruction bubble includes personnel, salaries, and benefits. And then capital outlay entails the cost of maintaining school buildings and physical structures within the locality. And then we've marked the other in yellow, which represents expenses such as interest or loans on loans or bonds that are taken out by a district to initiate projects that are outside of the traditional budget. And the graph on the next page just, again, really shows and hammers the point home just how much historically across the nation has been spent on personnel, salaries, and benefits, roughly 80%, which, again, I don't expect comes as a huge surprise to anybody on the phone. So the trend will certainly, we expect to see that as more and more states release their per pupil spending data, but it will be interesting to see sort of what variation there is, within districts, across schools, and to some extent across states, as states, as we hope and expect, states start to normalize how and sort of normalize how they report per pupil data, and we find more comparability across states. So that's the nuts and bolts as far as the provision and what we've seen and what we hope to see. So I'm going to, at this point, toss the mic over to Jessica, who's going to talk about how states are visualizing school level spending data for the first time on their state report cards.
Thanks, Duncan. So now we're going to take a look at how some states have started visualizing their per pupil data within their state report cards, which give detailed information about their districts and schools. So the first example you see here is Illinois. And as states have started releasing their report cards with new per pupil data, there are a few states that stand out for being easy to interpret and compliant. And so the first example we have here is Illinois, that once a school has been selected on the report card website, there's a special portion dedicated to school finances. The image on the left provides viewers a bar graph that compares spending for the individual school and the district average. The tabs at the top of the chart and the interactive filters provide even more information, such as the source of funds and the expenditure type. Additional details also provided when viewers hover over both the school and district averages, which lists important factors that contribute towards per pupil expenditures, such as enrollment numbers and student demographics. You can go to the next slide, please. Again, another feature of Illinois' report card is being able to compare schools' per pupil expenditures within a district. As you can see at the top right of the bar graph, the dotted reference line represents the district's average spending, which is extremely helpful when comparing spending across multiple schools within a district. The names of each school are located at the bottom of the graph, and additional student demographic data provides the needed context to rationalize why a school is spending above or below the district average. So Illinois is a state that has definitely spearheaded the ability to make inter-district comparisons when it comes to school spending, And we see this as a feature that's extremely essential and definitely initiates important conversations. You can go to the next slide, please. So another state that has gone above and beyond to visualize school level per pupil data is Ohio. So similar to Illinois, they have provided multiple ways to view this information to draw more comprehensive conclusions. So all the way to the left, you can see, you can easily interpret operating school expenses for the school and the state for comparative purposes, and they've even broken it down by instructional and non-instructional costs, and streams of revenue are also clearly labeled for the school and the district. The image in the middle gives more detail about how instructional and non-instructional expenses vary across the school, district, and the state. And finally, all the way to the right, the bar graph illustrates what portion of the school's per pupil expenditure is a share of the district expenses and how much directly pertains to the school. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, so our last state example is Georgia. At the bottom right of the report card, you can see the per pupil expenditure for the state, district, and school. And to the left, you'll see something that is specific to Georgia called a financial efficiency star rating. The financial efficiency star rating, or FESR as they say, is essentially a comparison of spending per student with overall academic performance. So the FESR is based on a scale of one half to 5 stars, and the rating is based on their college and career ready performance index that the state developed to measure school performance and the 3-year average per pupil expenditure. And so for more detailed information about the school level per pupil expenditure, viewers can click on the question mark in the FESR section. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So that link then brings viewers to a financial transparency dashboard that goes into great detail about how the money is spent at the school level. Here you can see how much a school spends on salary and benefits, non-staff support, professional development, facilities and maintenance, and new construction. On the upper left-hand side, there are additional options to view sources of revenue by system and much more. So Illinois, Ohio, and Georgia, and many other states have clearly prioritized making this data available in great detail and basically have started initiating meaningful conversations regarding equity and resource allocation. And we're really hopeful that these visualizations like these will enhance over time, and other states will hopefully follow suit in providing educators, families, and advocates with detailed per pupil information. You can go to the next slide, please. So in trying to understand where states even start when it comes to funding schools, it's really important to know that each state has its own method for doling federal and state money out into districts. So just to clarify, a state's funding formula is different than a state's per pupil expenditure. A funding formula is the calculation that a state uses to determine how much funding will be given to districts and is typically written into state legislation, meaning that the feds have no control over how much a state chooses to fund schools. And for many states, it has taken years or even decades to actually see change in a funding formula, meaning for many states, their formulas are extremely outdated. But some states have statutes that outline a base amount for districts to receive, and others that don't rely on calculating an amount for districts based on the number of students, the cost of resources, and/or programs. On the other hand, per pupil expenditure refers to how much money is actually spent per student. So again, ESSA, the new federal law, requires this number to be reported, and it often changes year to year. How the money is spent depends on the decisions made within districts and schools. And so, again, we know that this is a lot of new information, but Duncan's going to kind of go into what all this means for you as school leaders. So Duncan, take it away.
Awesome, thanks, Jess. So yeah, y'all might be sitting there going, what does this mean for me as a school leader? And I would just say, in our opinion, it means a lot. We're extremely confident that putting this information in the hands of principals is a huge step towards achieving better conversations about equitable student funding within districts and across districts and schools. So per pupil data is concrete evidence of how policymakers and district leaders and now school principals prioritize equitable spending to ensure that that students are getting resources they need to be successful academically and in life. So we're giving Edunomics Lab a huge plug here because they've been great thinkers and thought partners in this space. So I would say everything that we've covered today about per pupil expenditures is due in part due in part to the Edunomics Lab and the thinking and the work that they've done. It's housed at Georgetown University, and it's exclusively dedicated to exploring and modeling complex education finance decisions that inform education policy and practice. And the Collaborative for Student Success has teamed up on many occasions with the Economics Lab's director, Marguerite Rosa, to gain a deeper understanding of what this new data means for public and more for the public and more specifically for principals. Again, because we know how trusted principals are within your communities, and that includes, when talking about spending and finance and how money is used in not only your school but in the district and across the district as a whole. So the Edunomics team suggests that principals should use this new school level per pupil expenditure data to understand and build school budgets, provided they have the flexibility and support from their district leaders. Initially, principals should find out how much their school is spending per student and make comparisons to student performance. So when doing that, questions to ask are things like, does your school spending align with the academic goals of students? How are other schools with similar demographics or circumstances spending and performing, and thinking about whether or not opportunities exist to learn from one another. And then finally, thinking about decisions that you can make within your own school to ensure that you're spending, efficiently and providing students with what they need to be successful. So we recognize that, all this information, and Jess mentioned this, can seem a bit overwhelming, and you all have so much to do just in your day-to-day. But we do encourage you to see this as a new opportunity to tailor resources within your school to specific needs of your community. And it's again, it's more evidence in the quiver of how spending is going, and more a sort of firmer foundation to ask those questions about equity across the district that just might not have been, those questions may not have been as easy to ask before. And obviously, whereas spending across schools, that information in most cases, not all, but most cases, wasn't really a public information up until this point. Now it is. So it's just more likely that building principals, that district leaders, that state leaders, that community members will just be asking and having to answer more questions about why do differences exist, and like Edunomics says, why differences exist, and comparing that to school performance. So no one's implying that a school is definitely going to, students within a school are definitely going to do better on tests or whatever if the school gets more money. Like, that's not what we're saying at all. It's just being able to compare the two things and have a conversation about why schools are performing a certain way and why schools are being funded in a certain way as well. So almost the last slide here gets at some of the work that we, the collaborative and HCM, have done over the past year, and then partnered with NASSP to promote and get out to principals. So we convened a cohort of principals to talk about this issue and to develop some materials for supporting all principals across the country in talking about per pupil expenditure. And we just, again, I'll just say we appreciate not only NASSP but NAESP for helping to co-brand and to distribute some of that good stuff. So over the summer, we brought a bunch of principals together and to get their input on what they believe would be the most helpful tools for to understand and communicate new school level per pupil expenditure data. So the cohort attended a few classes hosted by Marguerite Rosa and the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown, and in addition to some messaging workshops in order to develop the documents that you see listed here. So the first is what we're calling a primer, basically outlines some of what we talked about here on the webinar today, and also what the law requires and how it impacts school leaders. So the big overall, like what it is and why we think principals should care. The second contains 5 simple action steps that we recommend, that not we actually recommended, the principal cohort recommended for principals once their school level data becomes available. The third is a resource of common questions that principals may receive from parents or community members about their school's per pupil expenditure. in addition to some suggested messaging tactics. And the last document that's called School Spending Quadrant Questions here was created based on a common analysis that I've referenced earlier that we've been seeing and used by many organizations to take a look at per pupil data. So most of these organizations have created some form of data visual to compare per pupil spending and student performance to get a better determination of how schools are spending their money to yield higher student outcomes, or to yield higher student outcomes. So schools will fall within one of four categories or quadrants if you do an analysis that way. You have some that fall into the quadrant of low spending and high achieving, then high spending, high achieving, and so on. And the collaborative and our cohort of principals collectively came up with some questions that principals could possibly ask their district leaders depending on which quadrant their school falls in, if the entire chart is looking at schools in one district. So all of these resources are available on NASSP's website, and we're also happy to follow up with an attachment if that's easier. Though I'm envious of how short this link is. Like, you don't even have to write it down; you can just memorize that. nassp.org/ppe to find all that stuff. So to sum it all up, public access to this new school-level PPE data presents an opportunity for actors such as yourselves to be a part of a broader conversation regarding school resource allocation and equity. We know that school leaders play a vital role in student success. Now, for the first time, there was a better chance to have input into the conversation regarding school spending, and you'll be supported in using these concrete data to achieve even more for your students. So our hope is that this webinar and the supporting resources provided by NASSP, will have given or will give you enough information to sort of understand what the requirement is and how it impacts your job and your communication as a school principal. So with that, that concludes the slides that we have here. We'd love to answer questions or continue the dialogue about what we see happening going forward.
Great, thanks, Duncan. So I'll take the privilege of asking the first question here. So we kind of talked about what PPE is, how it's rolling out a little bit, but I wonder if you can address for folks on the phone who may not have seen this yet in their state, kind of what the status is with the changes in the law and where this is rolling out. So some states have it already, other states it's coming soon. If folks aren't seeing that per pupil expenditures are available per school in their state yet, where can they look to find out when that would be coming?
That is an awesome question, Greg. Thank you for that. So the Edunomics Lab does a fantastic job of tracking which states have already released. So it's easy to find. If you just Google Edunomics Lab and go to their website, they have a map that that just highlights which states have already released, and you can even use their website to interact with some of the data that the state has provided, and then they'll link to the state report card where you can see more. And it looks like Jessica, thanks, just put that map in the chat for everybody to go take a look. And Jess has now saved me from reading out every state. So there are quite a few that released that towards the end of last year. So whereas middle of last year there was only a scant few states that had released data, there have been a lot more recently, and we expect, well, every state is required to release their per pupil expenditure data on their state report card for the report card that addresses this current school year. So the next time that your states, if they haven't already released per pupil expenditure data, the next time that your state updates their state report card with data from this current school year, per pupil spending should be on there.
Yeah, sorry, Duncan.
Did I answer?
Yeah, the first
Go
link
ahead,
that
Jessica.
I put, I don't know if it was active or not, but the second one should work. But it's basically an interactive data hub, and they are the ones who will have the most up-to-date information about whether or not your state has released that information. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify those two links there. I think the second one is better.
Great, thank you. Duncan and Jessica, can you guys also address some of the questions that principals may receive about this? So I think we covered how principals can use the new PPE data to advocate for their school and additional funding. But what if a member of the media or a concerned parent comes to them and says, hey, your school is only spending X number of dollars per student, whereas the same school with similar demographics in the district is spending more? How would you recommend that folks handle fielding questions like that from the community if people get access to this PPE data, which is now available, and have concerns about the spending in schools?
Yep, another great question, Greg. Thanks, and I'll sound off on this, and Adam and Jessica may have additions here. I think one thing to hit on, sort of first and foremost, when you get questions from people who are concerned or curious about why schools within a district are receiving are spending different amounts of money, is to go back to the fact that school context and demographics tend to vary significantly within a district, and I think that it sounds obvious when it's probably obvious to everybody on the phone here, but that's not necessarily obvious to a parent. So reminding a parent that school demographics vary widely across the district, and that students within those schools, then that means they might have different needs. So a common reason that one school might receive a lot more money, it looks like a lot more money than other schools around it, is just they have a student population that just has more needs, more special education students, more students that are English learners, and that we tend to see it at schools with high concentrations of those populations show increases in spending. So reminding parents that a lot of factors go into this, is I think a really important thing.
That's great.
Adam,
Thanks,
Jess,
Duncan.
Well, I do wonder, Adam, Jess, is there anything else that comes to mind for you?
Not that I know of. I am just thinking of like the resources that we referenced earlier. I think will definitely help clarify a lot of those, anticipated questions that you think you might be receiving. And I really feel like the principals offered really valuable input in kind of, just trying to prepare for, what could be coming down the pike.
Great, thank you. So let's look at the chat here. Again, if anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. So going to Robert Mars here from Nevada, a state-specific question. The Nevada legislature mandated that Clark County share school funding with the community and requires parents, teachers, and support staff members to sit on a school organizational team, which gives input on each school's strategic budget. It is very transparent. However, it does not currently show funding sources from federal, state, local, etc., but rather breaks it down by general budget, title funds, and state grants. Do you know if this meets the current ESSA requirements?
Yeah, great question. So when the data are reported on the school report card in every state, it must break out into federal, state, and local. If the Nevada legislature, mandated some other, process through which Clark County reports on this information, then, that's whatever Clark County would be doing would be complying with the state law. But in terms of the federal requirement that would be specifically found on the school report card, it would need to break out in federal and local as well. You're welcome.
Okay, great. And then let's take a question here from Amanda at NASSP. Amanda says, in addition to my day job at NASSP, I am also the treasurer of my son's elementary school PTA. Are the funds the PTA raises considered local funds and included in the PPE reporting requirements?
So yeah, another great question. The the way that the per pupil expenditure data are reported from the schools to the state, and then ultimately from the state and onto the school report card, is that they're breaking down. They'll break down what the money was spent on. So if a principal is walking down the street and finds a $5 bill and gives that $5 bill to the school, and the school spends that money on classroom supplies, then those $5 are counted in the per pupil expenditure calculation. So the same thing with PTA. I mean, if the PTA raises money for the school takes the money and spends it on one of the things that is required to be reported by the feds as per pupil expenditure, then yes, those funds are included. So if it's spent on sports uniforms, yes, that those funds are supposed to be counted in the per pupil expenditure. My guess is that as states are sort of learning about these requirements and implementing them, that you might have a state or two that misses that part and might need to go back and look again at what they're including in their expenditures, but it should be included as long as those funds are spent on a category that ESSA requires to be reported.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have in the chat. So if there's nothing else, Duncan, Jessica, and Adam, I want to thank you guys so much for joining this webinar today. I want to let everybody on the webinar know that we'll make a recording of this available and share it with you. Please feel free to share it with other principals and school leaders who are interested in learning more about PPE. And also go to that link, nassp.org/PPE, to find all of the additional resources that can help you advocate for your school and your students. Thank you very much, and that concludes our webinar today.
Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Greg.